This is Johnny Dosco. Stay tuned for another Score Sheet podcast. Holy Kadelka!
Hello, and welcome to another Score Sheet podcast. As I record this, we are just about to end the 9th week of the Major League season, so I thought it might be time for a little talk about assessing where your team is now that we're just a little bit more than a third of the way through the season. You know, in the first few weeks of the season, I think if you read articles or listen to radio shows, you probably hear a lot of talk about, hey, it's still early in the season, don't panic if guys are going badly, or don't trade for guys just because they've had a couple hot weeks. And I think now that the season's moved along a little bit, it's kind of a little easier to see where players and or teams are going to settle in for the 2012 season. You know, it was only a few weeks ago teams like, in real life, Philadelphia or Boston or the Angels were looking like they were going to be maybe among the biggest disappointments in baseball this year. Now all three of those teams have kind of righted the ship. They're all at 500 or a little above. Meanwhile, a couple of the surprising teams like Houston and Oakland that started out above 500, they've kind of settled back to where most people thought they'd be this year, and they're now a few games under 500. Probably the same thing is true of a lot of the teams in your Score Sheet league. You know, I think if you started out the year thinking that you had a really good team, and then it started out slow, if you stuck to it, and you're probably seeing that those players that you're counting on are doing more or less what you expected, hopefully at least anyhow, unless you've got guys like Tim Lincecum with a 5-something ERA. But for the most part, I think things are, you know, over 162 games, players perform kind of as expected, and certainly teams do, which is a whole group of players. So what you need to do as an owner is decide at this point whether it's time to pay a little more attention to what players have done this year and give up a little bit on what you thought they'd do in March. So if you're looking around for a trade, obviously you have to make decisions. Guys like Lincecum, who I mentioned earlier, you have to be a little careful when telling yourself, gee, this may not be his year. Maybe look a little below the surface stats. For instance, Lincecum with that ugly ERA, he is still striking out more than a batter per inning, which that's my favorite stat for predicting how a pitcher's going to do in future weeks, is how many strikeouts per inning they have. So while I certainly wouldn't pay as much for Lincecum today as I would have in March, you know, if the owner in your league is kind of tired of losing game after game with Timmy, maybe you can offer him a little less than you would have had to in March, or maybe even a lot less. I mean, I don't think you're going to get him for a bag of baseballs. Just like Pujols, even though he has an OPS under 700, I don't think you're going to get him for a bag of baseballs either. But both of those guys you might be able to get for, like I said, a lot less than you would have had to pay for in a trade in March, and they might well be worth it. Pujols has definitely heated up a little bit in the last few weeks. He's still certainly not worth the $250 million 10-year contract the Angels gave him so far. But he would be I think it's pretty clear he's going to do at least decently the rest of the year. If you're in a one-year league, then about all you can do is make trades and or draft players in these monthly in-season drafts we have. If you're in a keeper league, which a lot of Score Sheet team owners are, they're in leagues where you keep players from year to year, then what you need to do about this time is start deciding whether you're trying to win this year or whether you need to throw in the towel on this year and maybe start thinking about the future. We are only a third of the way through the season, so if you're right around 500, that's kind of a tough decision to make. But at this point, if you're playing more like 380 ball or you're playing well above 500, then those decisions become a little clearer. You know, if you're down there and this just is not going to be your year, there are some things you can do to build for the future. The first thing to know is to not do what some teams do, and don't trade away your budding superstar, your 27-year-old solid player. Some teams just go way overboard in this rebuilding projects, and those are the ones that seem to be rebuilding year after year after year. You know, you trade away a guy who's 27 or 28 for 3 22-year-olds, and what happens is that guy that's 27 now has 8 more years, say, of really good ball left in him. So don't do something crazy like trade Ryan Braun for 3 prospects if you're trying to rebuild for the future. Instead, you know, it's the guys that are in their 30s, maybe a Johan Santana who's having a really good month anyhow. but is 32, 33 and injury prone. You might be able, if you're not going to win this year anyhow, to turn him into some future value. But don't become one of those rebuild every year kind of guys. Think about it before you make a trade, whether you're giving up a guy that actually in 2 or 3 years might be the cornerstone of your winning team. But in the in-season drafts at this point, if you're not having a great year, you concentrate maybe on some of the guys that were just drafted yesterday or today in the Major League Baseball draft. We've added those players to the player list now. They'll be available in in-season drafts for the rest of the year. Or maybe trade, like I said, your 33-year-old for a couple 23-year-old prospects. On the flip side, if you're really decided this might be your year and you're going for it, then you should look around and try to fill some holes. Maybe this isn't the year you waste your draft picks on an 18-year-old that might help you in 4 years. Instead, maybe you spend your June supplemental draft pick on a backup shortstop that might get 100 at-bats for you the rest of the year if your starting shortstop is kind of an injury-prone guy. Another thing a lot of veteran score sheet players do this time of year is start trying to trade for the relievers who in real life have had a really good 2 months. Seems like every year there's a handful of relievers who start out the season really strong in April and May, and they carry that throughout the entire season. And at this point, you can now look at the statistics of players, see those guys that have, say, a 2.1 ERA, look like they're really going to have a solid 70 or 80 innings. And that can be a big difference for your team. You get a guy that 6th, 7th, 8th inning pitches for you, has a 2 ERA the rest of the year. You can also use him in the playoffs if you make that far. And oftentimes, if you have some depth other places, which is maybe why you're over 500 in the first place, you can afford to trade your 4th outfielder for some team's 2nd best reliever, or maybe a solid starting pitcher you have that you don't really need. You could trade him for a couple solid relievers. So I think at this point in the season, you do want to take a look at your team, especially if you're in a keeper league, like I said, and assess whether you're going for it in 2012, whether you're building for the future, and what you need to do to make either one of those things happen. Of course, if you have a whole bunch of disappointing guys like Adrian Gonzalez, Tim Lincecum, that litany of players that every year there's a few just disappointments, well, and you're in a one-year league, then I don't know, maybe what you want to do is try some different strategies, see if maybe you can shake things up and try some really low hooks for your pitchers. Maybe try sacrifice bunting earlier than you ever had before, or stealing a lot more, and see if maybe those things can shake your team up a little bit. Hope you're having a good season, though, and that you're not really in the desperation stage yet. And with 4 months to go, unless you're really far back, you should definitely tell yourself there's plenty of time to turn the ship around. Have a great day, and hope you enjoyed this.